The day I found out what a tree was really worth, it wasn't standing anymore. That's the part that still gets me. Not the lawsuits, not the money, not even the blackout that had half a county talking for weeks. It was coming home and seeing an empty space where something had stood longer than anyone alive could remember. I remember turning onto my gravel driveway just before sunset, coffee still sitting in the cup holder, radio humming low, thinking about absolutely nothing important. It had been one of those ordinary days that disappear from memory almost as soon as they happen. Then I noticed something felt wrong. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The house looked normal. The barn was where it always was. The fence line hadn't changed. But there was this strange stillness hanging over everything. Then it hit me. I couldn't hear the old oak. That probably sounds ridiculous if you've never lived around an ancient tree. But old trees have a sound all their own. Even when the air is still, they creak and groan and whisper. That oak had been making those sound my entire life. Suddenly, there was nothing. I parked the truck and got out slowly, already feeling a knot forming in my stomach. Then I looked toward the western edge of the property and just froze. The tree was gone, completely gone. All that remained was a massive stump nearly 8 feet across and piles of fresh sawdust scattered across the ground. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was looking at. I actually walked closer thinking maybe I was mistaken, maybe there had been storm damage, maybe something had happened while I was away. But no, somebody had cut it down. Deliberately. Efficiently. Recently. The smell of fresh wood still hung in the air. I stood there staring at that stump for what felt like 10 minutes before I noticed the tire tracks. Heavy equipment. Multiple vehicles. They led straight toward the new development behind my property. Now, if you've ever lived near one of those luxury housing projects, you already know the type. Glass everywhere. Modern architecture that somehow makes every house look exactly the same. Fancy names like Cedar Ridge Estates, even though they bulldozed every cedar tree within 3 miles. That development had been growing behind my land for almost 2 years. The company running it was called Hawthorne Communities, and their CEO, a guy named Brent Calloway, loved showing up in local newspapers talking about sustainable growth and community values. Community values. Funny phrase when you're standing over the remains of a 120-year-old tree somebody just murdered. As I walked around the stump, I spotted a sign jammed into the dirt. Cleared for utility expansion. That was it. No apology. No explanation. No permit number. Just 4 words. I actually laughed when I read it because I was so angry I didn't know what else to do. Utility expansion. They made it sound like they were upgrading a shopping center parking lot instead of destroying something my great-grandfather had planted. My grandfather used to tell stories about that tree. According to him, his father planted it when he returned from the First World War. Family photos existed with 4 generations standing beneath its branches. Every birthday, every graduation, every barbecue, every Christmas gathering during the years when we had warm winters, that tree showed up somewhere in the background. It wasn't just wood. It wasn't landscaping. It was history. My history. Their bulldozers had erased it in a single afternoon. The more I looked around, the angrier I got. Then I noticed something else. The ground beside the stump had been disturbed. Fresh dirt, scrape marks, a section of old metal partially exposed beneath the soil. That made me stop, because I knew exactly what that metal was. Most people wouldn't have recognized it. Most people wouldn't even know it existed. But my father had shown it to me when I was 14 years old. We had spent an entire Saturday clearing brush around the area, and he pointed at a rusted steel access, cover hidden beneath the roots. He told me, "Someday you're going to inherit this place, and when you do, remember this box matters more than it looks." At the time, I thought he was talking about old farm equipment or some forgotten utility connection. Years later, I learned the truth. Back in the 1970s, before any subdivisions existed out there, before shopping centers and gated communities spread across the valley, the city needed additional electrical infrastructure to support future growth. My family owned nearly 1,000 acres then. Instead of selling outright, my grandfather negotiated a complicated agreement. The city installed a relay station and load distribution junction on our property. They got access. We kept ownership. The equipment remained privately controlled under a long-term easement agreement. It was unusual, but perfectly legal. Over the decades, as pieces of land were sold off around us, that relay stayed exactly where it had always been, hidden beneath the oak tree, protected by it, marked by it, and, judging by the fresh scrape marks in front of me, Hawthorne Communities had absolutely no idea what they'd uncovered. I went back inside before dark and headed straight for my office. Most people use filing cabinets for taxes and insurance paperwork. My family kept 70 years of land records. I spent 3 hours digging through maps, surveys, easements, utility agreements, and property documents. The deeper I dug, the more interesting things became. By midnight, I had everything spread across the dining room table. Every boundary marker, every legal description, every signed agreement. And there it was, clear as day. The oak tree stood entirely on my property. The relay station remained under my ownership. The development company had no authorization to access either, which meant they hadn't just cut down a tree. They had trespassed. They had destroyed protected property. And worst of all for them, they had exposed a piece of infrastructure that powered nearly every home in their brand-new luxury development. I leaned back in my chair around 1 in the morning and stared at those documents. For the first time all day, I wasn't angry anymore. I was calm. And sometimes calm is a lot more dangerous than anger. Because that was the moment I realized something Brent Calloway and his company hadn't figured out yet. They thought they had taken something from me. What they didn't realize was that they had accidentally handed me all the leverage in the world. The next morning I woke up before sunrise, not because I had some grand revenge plan brewing in my head, but because I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that stump sitting out there in the dark. I made coffee, sat on the porch, and watched the first light crawl across the field where the oak used to stand. It felt wrong, empty, like somebody had knocked a tooth out of Smile. Around 7 o'clock, I grabbed the folder containing all the documents I'd found the night before and walked out to the relay station. The metal access cover was still partially exposed where their equipment had scraped away the soil. I knelt down and brushed sawdust off the surface. That's when I noticed something that made me laugh despite everything. One of their crews had actually spray-painted a utility marking arrow directly onto the cover. They genuinely thought they had discovered some abandoned piece of infrastructure. Nobody had bothered to check ownership records. Nobody had bothered to ask questions. They just assumed everything in sight belonged to them. That kind of arrogance is expensive. I unlocked the access panel and climbed down the short service ladder. The equipment wasn't pretty, but it was maintained. Every few years, the city inspected it. Every few years, I renewed the agreements. The relay handled load balancing for a substantial portion of the surrounding area, including Hawthorne's new development. I stood there looking at the master disconnect switch for several seconds. Legally, I had every right to shut it down for safety concerns. Legally, the exposed infrastructure had already been compromised by unauthorized excavation. Legally, nobody could force me to keep operating private equipment after it had been damaged. I reached over and pulled the switch. Nothing dramatic happened. No sparks, no explosions, no movie scene, just a mechanical click. Then I climbed back out and headed toward the house. About 30 seconds later, the neighborhood behind me disappeared. It happened so quietly I almost missed it. Streetlights blinked off. Decorative landscape lighting vanished. Security gates stopped moving. A row of expensive houses sitting on the hill suddenly looked strangely lifeless. By lunchtime, social media was already exploding. My neighbor Frank called first. Frank was retired, spent most of his days fishing, and somehow knew every piece of gossip within 50 miles. "You seeing this?" he asked before I could even say hello. "Seeing what?" I replied, try not to sound amused. "Whole fancy neighborhood's dead. No power anywhere." I looked out the window. "Really?" Frank snorted. "Don't play innocent with me." By evening, residents were standing in driveways, talking in clusters. Service trucks rolled in and out. Utility workers checked lines. Engineers inspected transformers. Nobody found the problem because they were looking everywhere except the one place they should have been looking. On the second day, the situation got worse. The backup generators started appearing. Portable units hummed beside multi-million-dollar homes. People ran extension cords through windows. The community Facebook page turned into a war zone. Somebody posted that they had lost an entire freezer full of food. Another homeowner complained their security system was offline. Someone else demanded refunds from the developer. Then local reporters got involved. That's when things really started snowballing. Hawthorne Communities had spent years marketing this development as the future of luxury living. Smart homes, advanced automation, premium infrastructure. Now, residents couldn't even charge their phones without running extension cords across their lawns. The irony was beautiful. On the third afternoon, I was repairing a fence near my barn when a black SUV came flying up my driveway. The driver barely stopped before jumping out. Brent Calloway. I'd seen his face on billboards and newspaper ads often enough to recognize him instantly. He looked different in person, less polished, more tired. The expensive suit was wrinkled. His jaw was tight. His smile looked forced. "Mr. Mercer," he called out. I set my hammer down. "Depends who's asking." He didn't appreciate that. "We need to talk." "Funny," I said. I was thinking the same thing when somebody cut down my tree. His expression shifted immediately. For a moment, I could actually see him trying to calculate how much I knew. "About that," he started, "there appears to have been some misunderstanding." I laughed so hard I nearly doubled over. "A misunderstanding?" He crossed his arms. "Our contractors believe the tree was within the development easement. Then your contractors are idiots." The smile disappeared completely. "I'd advise you to be careful. I'd advise you to read property surveys before cutting down century-old trees." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he got to the point. "The outage needs to end." There it was. Not an apology. Not concern about the tree. Not concern about trespassing. The outage. The money. The pressure. That was all he cared about. I walked past him and motioned toward the porch. "Come on." He followed me up the steps. I didn't offer coffee. I didn't offer water. I dropped a thick stack of documents onto the table between us. Property maps, easement agreements, ownership records, inspection reports. Brent flipped through them in silence. I watched his face change page by page. Confidence faded first, then irritation, then concern. Finally, something close to panic. "These documents are old," he said. "Still valid. The city uses this equipment. Doesn't own it. That can't be right. Yet somehow it is." He stared down at the papers again. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. Every attorney he had spoken to was probably telling him the same thing by now. This wasn't a public utility dispute. This was private property, private infrastructure, private rights, and they had walked directly into the middle of it. "What do you want?" he finally asked. That question told me everything. 3 days earlier, he would have issued demands. Now he was negotiating. "I've already filed reports," I said calmly. "Trespassing, destruction of protected property, unauthorized excavation around electrical infrastructure." His jaw tightened. The tree wasn't protected. I slid another document across the table. Certified appraisal, historical registry records, environmental valuation reports. Actually, it was. He looked down and went silent. The valuation alone was enough to make most people choke. Mature heritage trees aren't cheap. Not when they're documented. Not when they're irreplaceable. Not when attorneys get involved. "You're serious," he muttered. "Very." We sat there for a long moment. Finally, he leaned back and rubbed his forehead. For the first time since arriving, he looked less like a CEO and more like a guy realizing he'd stepped into quicksand. "The homeowners are furious," he admitted. "I imagine they are. Sales have stopped. That's unfortunate. Our investors are demanding answers." "Sounds stressful." He glared at me. I smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had spent 3 days staring at a stump where his family's history used to stand. Brent left without another word. Over the next several days, things continued unraveling. Residents organized meetings. Lawyers started circling. Local newspapers published stories questioning how a major developer could lose power to an entire subdivision. Every day, the pressure increased. Every day, Hawthorne Communities lost more money. Then something happened I hadn't expected. One evening, there was a knock at my door. Standing outside was a woman I'd never met, maybe mid-30s, exhausted expression. She introduced herself as Natalie. She lived in the development. At first, I thought she was there to complain. Instead, she surprised me. "I heard about the tree," she said quietly. "My grandfather had one like that." We talked for nearly half an hour. She wasn't angry. She wasn't demanding anything. She simply understood loss. Before leaving, she glanced toward the empty field. "For what it's worth," she said, "most of us didn't know what they did. If we had, we would have stopped it." After she left, I stood on the porch for a while thinking about that. The homeowners weren't my enemies. Most of them were decent people who had bought houses believing the promises they'd been sold. The real problem sat in corporate offices and boardrooms where decisions got made by people who viewed land as numbers on spreadsheets. That realization changed something. I still wanted accountability. I still wanted justice. But I no longer wanted revenge. By the end of the week, Brent called asking for another meeting. This time his voice sounded completely different. The arrogance was gone. The confidence was gone. All that remained was urgency. I agreed to meet him the following morning, and as I hung up the phone, I had a feeling the conversation was finally going to become very expensive for Hawthorne Communities. The next morning, Brent arrived 10 minutes early. That alone told me how much had changed. The first time he'd come to my property, he'd walked around like he owned the place. This time he parked neatly, carried a briefcase, and waited by the porch until I came outside. Funny how quickly people learn boundaries when ignoring them starts costing money. We sat down at the same table where he'd looked through my documents a week earlier. Only now there were 2 attorneys with him and another stack of paperwork sitting in front of his briefcase. Nobody bothered with small talk. One of the lawyers opened a folder and slid several documents across the table. Compensation for the tree. Full reimbursement of legal expenses. A revised infrastructure agreement that included monthly payments for the relay station. Environmental restoration funding. Additional liability protections. The numbers were substantial. More money than most people would expect from a dispute over a tree. But this had never really been about a tree. It was about consequences. Brent watched me read through the papers. "We've accepted responsibility," he said carefully. "Our contractors acted without proper verification." I glanced up. "Your contractors work for you." He nodded. "Fair enough." That was probably the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to get from him. I kept reading. The attorneys remained silent. Birds chirped somewhere beyond the pasture. The morning breeze moved through the grass where the oak used to stand. Finally, I set the papers down. "Almost." Brent frowned. "Almost. There's one thing missing." The attorneys exchanged looks. Brent sighed. "What is it?" I stood up and pointed toward the empty space near the western edge of the property. Everyone followed my gaze. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I said the only thing that had mattered to me since this whole mess started. "Replace it." Brent blinked. The tree. The tree." One of the attorneys immediately jumped in. "Mr. Mercer, with respect, a tree of that age can't simply be replaced." "I know. Then what exactly are you asking for?" I looked back toward the field. The largest mature oak that can reasonably be transplanted. Professional installation. Long-term maintenance. Soil restoration. Everything necessary to give it a chance. Brent was quiet for several seconds. Then he nodded. "Done." The attorney looked surprised. Brent didn't. I think by then he understood something that had taken him a while to learn. This wasn't about squeezing every dollar possible out of the situation. If it had been, we would have spent years fighting in court. This was about making the damage visible, about acknowledging that some losses deserve more than a check and a legal settlement. The paperwork was finalized within 2 weeks. The power came back online shortly afterward. I still remember the night the development lit up again. One moment the neighborhood sat dark against the hillside. The next, windows glowed, streetlights flickered on, and garage doors hummed back to life. It looked almost like nothing had happened. But plenty had happened. Residents had learned who really controlled the relay. Investors had learned the cost of cutting corners. And Brent Calloway had learned that property lines aren't suggestions. A few months later, the replacement tree arrived. Watching that operation was honestly impressive. Massive trucks, cranes, arborists, specialists measuring root systems and soil conditions. The new oak wasn't ancient. It wasn't the giant I had lost. Nothing could ever be. but it was mature enough that you could imagine future generations sitting beneath its branches someday. When the crew finished planting it, I walked out there alone near sunset. The same time of day I had discovered the stump months earlier. The valley was quiet. The new tree stood against the orange sky, still small compared to the memory of the old one, but alive, growing, trying. And for the first time since all this began, I felt something close to peace. Not victory, not satisfaction, peace. Because here's the truth nobody tells you about winning. Real victories rarely feel like celebrations. They feel like closure. They feel like finally setting down a weight you've been carrying for too long. A few days later, I ran into Natalie, the homeowner I'd met during the outage. She laughed when she saw the new tree. You know, she said, "People still talk about you around the neighborhood. Good things, I hope." She grinned. "Depends who you ask." Then she pointed toward the oak. "I like the tree." "Me too." She looked back at the development and shook her head. "Honestly, some people think you went too far." I laughed. "I'm sure they do. Others think you didn't go far enough." That made me laugh even harder. And maybe that's the interesting part. Even now, years later, people still disagree about what happened. Some say shutting down the relay was justified because property rights matter and actions should have consequences. Others say innocent homeowners got caught in the middle of a fight they didn't create. Maybe they're both right. Maybe that's why this story never really goes away. Life isn't as clean as people want it to be. Sometimes the law, fairness, and personal morality overlap perfectly. Sometimes they don't. What I know is simple. A company decided something belonged to them because it was convenient. They never asked permission. They never checked the facts. They never considered what they were destroying. Then they learned a lesson the expensive way. Today, whenever I sit on my porch in the evening, I can see that young oak growing beside the relay station. The neighborhood beyond it is thriving. Kids ride bikes through the streets. Families walk their dogs. Porch lights glow after dark. Everything looks peaceful. But every time someone asks about the tree, the story comes back. And every single time, the debate starts all over again. So now I want to ask you the same question people around here still argue about. If someone destroyed a piece of your family's history without permission, and you had the legal power to hit back exactly the way I did, would you have shut the power off too, or would you have handled it differently? Let me know down in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious where you stand on it. And if you've ever dealt with neighbors, developers, HOAs, or anyone who thought they could ignore your rights because they had more money or more influence, share your story as well. I read every comment. And trust me, some of the best stories come from people who've lived through situations just as unbelievable as this one.